So, welcome to the leading edge of sword and sorcery. It's something close to that. If you didn't want to hear about that, you're in the wrong room. We're waiting one more panelist, Dedren Snead, who should be present. So I'll ramble for a few minutes, and we'll start with some introductions too. So the way this is going to go is we have an hour in the room, kind of, but really we only have 50 minutes to chat, and then we got to get out, right? Because that's part of the game. So I'm going to leave room for questions and answers at the end, but also if you're dying to jump into the conversation, raise your hand. I'll be keeping an eye out to make sure you guys get your questions answered.
We like questions. They're important.
Yep.
They help the flow of conversation.
Yep.
Keep it conversational.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think when the last speaker shows up, I'm going to subject this poor guy in the front row to take a picture of us. So there might be a quick interruption. And this might be pitched multiple times. Well, yeah, maybe we'll see what happens. I was going to pitch this device, but I think Sean is already ready to do that too. I'll pitch it a little bit, but this is the first time, this Rider Symposium USB stick's the first time we've ever done this. And it was hard to get Gen Con's permission to do something like this, but it's $30. Has roughly 30 contributors from the authors here, including new releases, which might be talked about here. In fact, anyone in here who doesn't want to buy this afterwards, I'd be kind of surprised. There's a gem in this one, for sure. But some of the money goes to the authors who contributed, but actually most of the money goes into a pool to help underrepresented authors travel here next year. So it helps us grow, and it's a really good deal. And we only made 500 of these, and there you go. So there's my pitch, and there's a publicist on board here who could probably fill in a bit more. And you're welcome to do that.
He has resting pitch face.
That's right. but wait.
Matt John, redeemed.
So what we're going to do here for a bit is...
I was.
Oh.
I could tell.
I want to, so I'm Seth Lindberg. I'm actually chairing this whole Writer Symposium.
So big hand for Seth.
Thanks for that. I'm an amateur sword and sorcery writer. I like writing. I have about 15 short stories out there, and I do editing for Blackgate Magazine as well. Anyway, I'm a big fan of sword and sorcery, and yes.
This is how you make it interesting.
It is. Dedren Snead, everybody.
Just have a long time. No worries.
Just in time. I think we'll start with Matthew John, who we'll just go down and give you guys all a quick minute to introduce yourselves and while you're in the room, and then we'll jump in. So I would pass the mic. We have no mic. You're first.
Oh, hi. I'm Matthew John. That's the author name. I go by Matt, but...
He's Canadian.
He's Canadian. That's why.
Yeah. It was either Matthew John or Matthew Jacques, and I don't speak French, so that would be Anyways, I too am an amateur sword and sorcery author of sorts. Might get that pro pay soon. There's something lingering, which is very nice. So do this. Oh gosh, what do? I wear so many hats. I am one of the hosts of the Rogues in the House podcast. We talk sword and sorcery. Please do check that out if this is something you're into when you're here, so it ought to be. We're also doing some publishing lately. This is called The Book of Blades Volume 2, which suggests there's a Volume 1, which there is, and both are great. It's a mixture of pros and fellas like you and I who are climbing the ladder. Just great TOCs, so I highly suggest you pick that up. I encourage you to do so. I'm also a game designer. I work for Monolith on the Conan board game, as well as I'm developing the next Conan role-playing game, and I'm here kind of doing some guerrilla-style playtesting, so that's been sweet. That's a Book of Blades, Volume 2.
Dedren,
Right.
you're trying to introduce yourself. Yep.
Oh, thank you. And howdy, y'all. Everyone's doing well. My name is Dedren Snead out of Atlanta, Georgia. Founder of Sassoon Studios, and I have a Sword and Soul fantasy series called Sorghum and Spear. It's a fantasy series about girls that beat up monsters. And so, yes, absolutely. And but to that, work in the space of Afrofuturism and how we can take inclusive stories from Black and African storylines and culture diaspora, and how can we bring that into the fantastic. And so, for us, working in science fiction, but particularly here in Sword and Soul, and really just finding a way to find inclusive ways for stories and mechanics to appreciate culture and also just make it expansive and more open and open source for everyone to feel included in this space. So thank y'all.
My name is Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I am one of the editors at Bain Books, where I'm also the media and military liaison, meaning I handle all of our press, our PR, and anything that has to do with the United States military. Previously, I was in the U.S. Army. I spent 10 years as a reporter, and as of 3 months ago, became a father.
Woo!
I am strictly amateur as a Sword and Sorcery author at the moment, but as an editor, as you'll see from many of our fine wares, this summer has been a damn good summer for Sword and Sorcery fans at Bain Books. And we'll be giving 3 of them away at the end of this panel, so please stay back if you want some goodies. But I said 3, meet the main course. Howard, take it away.
So, you may notice that I am a Bain writer then. My new Sword and Sorcery series, the first book came out 2 days ago, and here it is. Here it is. I'm so delighted. I'm still shaking a little bit. Yeah, and I'm delighted to have this series, and you have to wait a really long time for the second book because it doesn't come out until October.
And our most recent episode of the Rogues in the House podcast actually features Mr. Jones, so tune in and have a listen.
And I don't know if I steal any thunder, but my impression was, and I'll try a copy of that is in here, right?
Indeed, it is
Yeah.
on the USB drive, thumb drive, whatever, finger
Right.
drive.
As well as a copy of my Aliens Secretly Living on Earth anthology, which
Right.
also came out. So 2 new books and a whole bunch of other good stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. There we go. So that's the quick intro. You guys gloss over a lot of other important history of these guys that will sneak in the conversation. So we're supposed to be talking about where Sword and Sorcery is going, like the leading edge. And I don't want to get mired in too much on the definition of Sword and Sorcery, but in order to talk about where we're going, we have to at least cover, at least briefly, where we were on it. And maybe we'll go in reverse order this time and just, quickly, 1-2 minute-ish thing. If you can discuss your impression about how the beginnings of Sword and Sorcery, and then maybe how it developed according to your perspective. So, Howard, what do you got on that?
Sure. So, Sword and Sorcery was originally coined by Fritz Leiber to distinguish it from the kind of fiction he and Robert E. Howard, well, Robert E. Howard's dead by then, but the kind of fiction that they created versus the kind of fiction that they saw in Lord of the Rings. Now, in the cinema, it's presented fairly similarly. There's someone fighting monsters with a sword, but on the page, there's distinct differences. Sword and Sorcery was created in the magazines, so if you're passing a magazine back in the 30s, or the 30s or 40s, and you stop to take a look at a magazine, you flip open one of the stories. If it doesn't grab you in the first paragraph, you're going to put it back. So the writers of Sword and Sorcery had to make sure that they grabbed you right from the get-go, and that pacing is pretty specific to Sword and Sorcery. The other thing is that unlike a novel where you frequently in fantasy novels you start slow and you get a sense for the world, and maybe the character's reluctant to get started on their journey, maybe the character's someone young and they're learning to get their skills together before they can master what they're doing. Sword and Sorcery started there in the magazines, and you had to you didn't have time for any of that, right? You had to have someone who already knew what they needed to do and was ready for the adventure. More like watching a TV show where you're watching the professionals do their job.
At least another factor that's very important to it is incredibly character-driven. I mean, just think of all of these wonderful characters in the Sword and Sorcery genre that have stood the test of time. Conan, Alaric of Melniboné, Cain, Indra...
Oh.
Imaro.
Imaro, of course,
Yeah.
Imaro. You can't forget Imaro.
Farfod and the Grey Mouse.
Farfod and the Grey Mouse. I always struggle with Farfod's name.
Well.
Jorel of Jory.
Fafard.
You have it compared to epic fantasy, where typically there is a large cast. It is almost entirely character-driven. Beyond that, typically there is some. I wouldn't even know how to describe it. They are not paragons of virtue, typically. Conan was a thief, a reaver, a slayer. Elric of Melniboné killed his entire kingdom and slept with his cousin. Cain is literally would be the villain in any series of epic fantasy, and happens to be the hero in Sword and Sorcery because he faces people worse than him. and Farfod and the Grey Master are thieves. It's a genre that loves the underdog, facing fearful odds and taking them on with vim and vigor, and that by the end of the story you should feel your pulse pounding and have a big old grin on your face when done well.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
no, absolutely. Just to say, I think these are great spaces, and a thing to that, and you alluded to the character Morrow and the space of Sword and Soul by Charles Saunders, who worked in this space, and also the subgenre of sword and sorcery being sword and soul, and kind of using that as a complement to the space of Afrofuturism and science and speculative fiction. Meaning that in very similar ways, and in his works and in all the seminal spaces, the idea of the introspective character and the fact of the environment, the desolation, being a lot more internalized than looking at the grand scape of, say, something like a Forgotten Realms, or the large cast of characters. Really, it is the person, their virtues or lack thereof, and the road ahead. And so I think a lot of that took the genre and made it more humanized, more singular. But again, I think for a lot of readers of Sword and Sorcery, a space of the human existence, of having a barrier and overcoming it, and then the loss or the gains that came thereafter. And so I think it made a larger genre very simple, but a lot more accessible for readers.
Well, I mean, everyone else said all the good points, but
Talk about the horror.
yeah, exactly. There's a few things that I would highlight. Yes, horror is pretty intrinsic within the genre, and it's part of what really attracts me to the genre. Is that a lot of other epic fantasy, you have snatches of that, but not a total amount. I mean, Sword and Sorcery too you often have an outsider protagonist, right? Someone who's a fish out of water, and they're just being badass in themselves despite all of their surroundings. And oftentimes that is facing down horrific things with a mirthless grin on their face, stabbing mercilessly. It is often violent storytelling as well. The fleet pace, to me, is very important. I don't think a slow plotting thing can be considered Sword and Sorcery. And if all other definitions fail, think about what epic fantasy is. Think about the hero's journey. And Sword and Sorcery isn't really that. It's not so much the chosen one or any of that business. Oftentimes the magic is a little more low. It can be very rooted in history. It's a genre where you can also judge a book by its cover, because the covers are badass, and what's inside is also going to be that. Go ahead. You got nothing left.
Not much. No, I mean, big picture. So we're talking like roughly 1920s-ish. That was the pulp era. And then right. So we have his pen pals of Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft kind of introduced a bit of a horror, weird elements as well that kind of overlap. And I think back then everything was just kind of like weird fiction, and what we know today is fantasy or horror have been kind of separated since then. But back then they didn't necessarily mark those as different genres yet. So there's, and a lot of people, the sword sorcery area always go back to Robert Howard because he is kind of like the father, I guess, of the genre. But it has evolved since then. So there's some different camps. I think some people think if you don't write like Howard, then it's not sword and sorcery. And then of course there's obviously elements that he wrote that can be reapplied to any story. So things have evolved. So I'll share one, aha moment I had in my life, and maybe I'll see if you guys can build up on your own there. Actually, going back to Charles Saunders, I thought I kind of understood where sword sorcery was, and I think maybe 15 years ago, I through interacting like in Goodreads online, I learned about Charles Saunders, and I'm like, what is this sword soul stuff? And then picked it up, and it was like, well, this is awesome. It was awesome because, well, it wasn't like European centric. It was he drew upon like these African continent myths that I didn't know, but he blended in it, but he still had all the same action stuff. So it just felt totally new, and it was new. But he made it his own, and I think that's one reason why the genre kind of evolves, right? So we kind of discussed some key elements from 1930s all the way up to roughly 70s, I guess. I don't know, but I figured you guys all had your own aha moments about what you shifted your vision of what sword and sorcery was, and maybe I want to lead into where it's going now, right? So as you look back when you first discovered it versus where it's going, I just wonder maybe when you discovered a different author or a different perspective, when did you learn that Sword and Sorcery may have been bigger than Howard?
Howard.
Yeah, bigger than Howard Andrew Jones. That's right. I was thinking Robert Howard, but yeah. So I can pick on someone. Or Sean, you're looking at me. You're next. Yeah.
Put on the spot. I love it.
Yeah.
So, at least in my opinion, Sword and Sorcery has 3 great eras. It had the golden age of Howard, Lindberg, C.L. Moore back in the 30s through the 50s. Everything from Conan the Barbarian to Dying Earth. Then you had your second wind with the New Wave authors in the 60s and 70s, right before Terry Brooks and Epic Fantasy kicked the crap out of it. That was where you had Michael Moorcock, Charles Saunders, Carl Edward Wagner, all these authors who still had that blood and thunder of the original Sword and Sorcery, but occasionally did some very twisted stuff with it, whether it was representing mythos and cultures that were not previously represented, as Saunders did, or in the case of Moorcock, where he pulled off one of the few subversions that stands of its own merits, with Elric of Melniboné, the anti-Conan. Or, of course, Carl Edward Wagner, whose whole contribution was basically, what if I just turned the horror and violence up to 11? And it's glorious. And, of course, now you have today, and I think that part of that is epic fantasy and Sword and Sorcery have sort of gone back and forth as the domineering taste in the genre. I have multiple theories on why. I will notice that for the boom in the 30s and the boom in the 70s, I bet that economic depression in both cases really helped the appeal of hard on their luck heroes facing challenges. With the boom of Sword and Sorcery we have now, I am so sorry to anyone who has stocks in the next few years, but we like, especially after years of epic scale stories, or in this case, grimdark fantasy, it's nice to have heroes who, at the end of the day, are trying to save their people, want to defend their family, just want to make a little gold and earn their reputations, fight the elves throughout space and time that are trying to kidnap children. Sword and Sorcery can go all sorts of wild ways, but I love that it's coming back in vogue simply because of that action, the fact that you can dive into cultures and characters in a way that epic fantasy simply does not. And of course, the blood and thunder. You gotta love the action. Sorry to go overboard.
Oh, you're good. Dedren?
I think very well and succinct to that. I think a lot of it likewise is I think our taste in media and music have absolutely driven that a bit of that back and forth. So I think through the space of to the 70s where there was that shift into like the revisitation of small screen, small media, but I think that also works in the space of blaxploitation, where we had a lot more independent filmmakers that were raised in those 30s, 30s to 60s in that genre, were able to pull that in. And likewise, I think the classic rock into the thunderous rock era of the late 70s, early 80s, also were drawn from people who grew up in that sense. And of course, the idea and the advent of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games also fed into that space. And I think that gave like a great renaissance of that independent creation that we're now seeing again. And so now with technology where we can go back and have these conversations and have just an amassment of media, data, and games, now we can kind of look at the genre and see that it's the same as it's ever been. And I think it's got a great humanistic side that, again, it stood the test of time. And as we've seen these larger components, these larger worlds, now we're trying to break them down into just a single characters. And we're used to larger worlds, larger worlds that have multiple characters. But now, looking at that single character storyline fits right in the space of Sword and Sorcery.
Right.
If I may take this time to transition slightly, I think you're talking about modern media and things too. It's that we're kind of in an episodic era of sorts, right? Like, I don't know, maybe this is anecdotal, but attention spans don't seem to be all that they were. And
I got that, Howard.
Sorry, Howard. No, wait. Now you've actually screwed me up.
Attention spans.
Yeah, attention spans. Like, but you're looking at things like epic fantasy too, where, and this is not to throw shade on giant doorstopper books. That's fine. If that's what you're into, that's fine. But it's great to have an alternative. And also there's rumors of paper printing costs. Well, that's not a rumor. It's gone up, and I think publishers now are a little more like, ooh, maybe we do need shorter books. And I don't know, it's interesting that we've had this conversation for, I mean, everyone, except for, I've met you today, good to meet you. But we've been talking about, like, is there an inlet for shorter form storytelling, short stories, novellas? And I mean, Sword and Sorcery, it doesn't mean there's not novels, because there has been for a long time, but there's something really appealing about bite-sized fiction. And there's a lot of indie publishers, but I don't want to say that in a way that's like indie equals not edited garbage. I mean, like indie people who are really firing on all cylinders and delivering this material, and there's so much of it out there that I am optimistic that audiences are going to pick up a lot of these things because we advertise it to death, mostly in our own circles, which is part of the problem.
Yeah.
But I think this bite-size storytelling might be good for the sort of Netflix generation or the YouTube generation of, you know what I mean? And I welcome that, and I encourage other people to do it too, right? Like, we've got, there's honestly no, if you're even a little bit interested in this, there's magazines like Whetstone is a publication that keeps going. It's digital only. That's Whetstone, W-H-E-T, W-H-E-T, Stone. It releases this stuff for free, online only, and the stories are 2,500 words max. So you can check it out on your lunch break and see how that goes. And then there's, you know,
Tales from the Magician's Skull.
Well, yeah, we can get into that. Tales from the Magician's Skull is an excellent publication. The A Book of Blades series is pretty good as well. And we also had Old Moon is a great publisher. And you can
later on near the end we'll list off all the new markets, but those are.
Yeah, I guess it's that I think we have a opportunity here to kind of seize on the moment of perhaps a little bit of a breather from epic fantasy door stoppers to a little more episodic storytelling. So,
And kind of connecting to episodic storytelling, that was your approach to the Chronicles of Hannibal.
Sure. I mean, the pitch, I won't bore you with the entire pitch, but the approach was that I wanted to create a series of episodes that build one upon another, like a modern television series, where each one feeds into the next one, and then it feels like a season whole. So each book ends with a season climax. So characters might get introduced here, and it turns out later that they're actually doing this. An arc might get introduced here, and then later resolved. Background details. We find out more about the characters as we go, etc., etc., etc. But the game I played as I wrote it is, if this were a TV show and you tuned in, you would understand everything that was happening and you would enjoy it. Except I think for the season finale. I think to really enjoy a season finale, you really have to have seen what leads up to it. So yeah, that's how not just book one is structured, but that's how each of them is structured.
yeah, and I remarked on this when we were talking on the podcast a few days ago. It's I think that's a brilliant way to package it. The idea that it's like seasons of storytelling. The modern audience, even the reader, understands that, right? Everyone knows what a season is, and they're very used to binging it and consuming it. And so, pick up that book.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot of places we could go. One thing I'd like to hit on is, there has certainly been growth in the type of topics covered within the Sword and Sorcery, but I'm not sure really about the diversity of like genders. There's not a lot of women writers, I think. But I thought we should discuss that. You mentioned Seal Moore. So she, right?
Seal Moore, Tanith Lee.
Yeah.
God, tip of my tongue.
Well, my favorite is Lee Brack.
There we go.
Yes.
Now, technically, she was writing Sword and Planet for space opera, but I don't care. She was awesome. She could do whatever she wanted. I mean, she basically was kind of writing Firefly stuff 30 years before Firefly existed, and she blurred genres. So sometimes, they land on a planet on a spaceship, but then they adventure around with a sword, maybe a ray gun with a couple of shots left. It feels an awful lot like Sword and Sorcery. And unfortunately, if she's known it all today, it's because the last thing she wrote before she died of cancer was the very first draft of The Empire Strikes Back. But she's so much more than that. She's like a footnote. Oh yes, she was involved in Star Wars. Well, she's frickin' awesome, and she ought to be read more. And I think the reason that she doesn't have anything to do with her gender, thank God. I think it's because she only had one series character, and he's only in 3 books. She wrote a whole bunch of standalones. And the other reason is because she wrote in a solar system that we don't have anymore. The old science fiction idea where you could go to Mars and you could breathe the air and it was full of dying cities of an ancient Martian race. You'd go to Venus and it was a jungle planet. You'd go to Mercury and there was a slender band right on the equator that wasn't too hot or too cold. Yeah, and I think it's sad that we can't imagine that. We can imagine a secondary world where there's elves running around or evil demons can be summoned, but we can't still pretend, oh, what if Mars had dying cities on it? Anyway, she's great.
Can't we?
Oh, did you say
Can
this?
you recommend one title that,
One title
like you
first.
would recommend like one title that
Yeah, sure.
captures that?
So there's a really slim novel she wrote called, it's titled 2 different things, depending on where it was reprinted. I think the most common, and you could get it in a cheap old paperback, would probably be The Sword of Rhiannon, Rhiannon. Also The Sea Kings of Mars. And if you want to get a sampling of some of her best stuff, there's still The Best of Lee Brackett, which her husband put together. And you can get a used copy of that. And it's Lee, Leigh. And I believe that, I think there's been
Yes.
collections of some of her stuff.
As it turns out, she's one of Tony Weisskopf's favorite
I
authors.
did not know that, but that might explain why
Yeah.
Tony liked my stuff. Anyway, yeah, she's good.
I think too, it's funny though, we started listing off the female authors and then we almost got stumped by the third one, right? And so I'm noticing today too, when we're talking about, bringing people in who weren't necessarily invited previously or who weren't encouraged to come into it. And now you're seeing far more diversity amongst the authorship of this kind of fiction. And we're not making blockbusters here with this genre, but
Yet.
yeah, exactly. But it is becoming far more diverse, and I mean, just I can wrap off, T.A. Marketan, Cora Boulert, Bryn Hammond are just 3 that are circulating.
Milton Davis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Kirk A. Johnson, if we're talking about non-white dudes writing this stuff, then yeah, exactly. And so it's all the better for that, and this is something that excites me, and it's happening on a sort of indie level.
Well, we even let Canadians do it now.
Yeah, even Canadians. Matt Jacques. Actually, all right, I'm going to pitch this here. I'm thinking of an anthology
Yeah, go ahead.
called Swords and Sorries. An anthology of Canadian sword and sorcery authors, huh?
I may just to say,
Please do, yeah.
because I was, just thinking, like I'm in my bag. I've got this anthology that'll come out here in the next couple of weeks. It'll actually have, I'm looking on the back, this has like 10 new women writers in the sword and sorcery space as an anthology of Sorghum and Spear. I know like a couple of them, Zelda Knight, also Sarah A. Macklin, Cherie Renee Thomas, who's one of the special guests here, and wrote on Black Panther. That's I think there's a resurgence, particularly of women writers that are building in this space. But I think, as I was saying earlier, I think it's absolutely an opportunity that we still need to pursue. But we have a lot of that work that is actually being done right now.
The one thing I just want to add before we go on is that, like, it's absurd that we wouldn't have people that were underrepresented traditionally be in this genre, since it is a genre where you are oftentimes feeling like an outsider protagonist.
Right.
So-
they're almost ideal to draw upon.
Yeah. Exactly.
Struggle. Yeah.
It's essential, in my opinion.
Sean?
I think part of it might also just be until fairly recently there weren't a lot of markets.
Right.
Like just in the past 5 years, we've had more perennial magazines in sword and sorcery put out than probably the past 15. Am I not wrong?
Well, no, and I think that shows a hunger for the form that the major publishers haven't been delivering.
Present company excluded, of course.
Present company excluded. No, I think people have wanted a change in pace, and they've been trying to find it, and it hasn't been out there, and big publishing hasn't been paying too much attention.
Right. So go ahead.
And I know at least there are scores of authors I know that would love to take a crack at it. It's just again, your choice is pitch a novel to Bain or hope you get a story in Tales of the Magician's Skull.
Right.
So-
There's some other ones, yeah, but not, those are probably the higher level ones. And the other ones are a bit more of the ground up.
I mean, there are some great other ones. I mean, Story Hacks, Ursova, Old Moon. There are so
we're
many.
going to end with all that. So one of your last comments
Okay.
is going to tell
Spoilers.
people where to go. All right? Yeah.
I would also just say that right now too is an interesting opportunity. Titan Publishing took over the Conan books, so they're doing new fiction. S.M.
Yeah.
Sterling did the most recent one,
Yeah.
and there's a bit of a question mark on what the next ones are, but I kind of know.
Jamie Gates had something in there, didn't she?
Yeah. There's some things going on. So that's coming back, but also the Conan the Barbarian comic just came back raging and like broke a lot of records, and it outsold Spider-Man this month. And Conan hadn't really done that in a while, but he had done it in the heyday of Marvel, which does tell me there's certainly a nostalgia for it. And I mean that's your visual medium, but
Right.
all the same, I think it just seems interesting that people are looking for this sort of.
Right.
I think we're all over Marvel.
Yeah, on something new. So there's yeah, we'll go to some of the markets at the end. I will call upon one though is explicitly called is New Edge Sword Sorcerer from Oliver Brackenberry, and then he's explicitly targeting or trying to invite in underrepresented authors in Sword Sorcery. And that's a great magazine. But I'd like to hear more about Dedren's story too, because you know Milton Davis, and he's been like I know him more online and through some other communications, but he's been another one of my role models for just attacking the community and doing stuff. And I know you know him well, and can you talk about some of your experience?
Oh,
with
absolutely.
Milton?
Oh, no, thank you. And so there's a particular set of authors, but we'll talk particularly about Milton J. Davis of MB Media out of Atlanta. He is a student of Charles Saunders and really has expanded this space of sword and soul, but really sword and sorcery. And I think he's had the privilege of being in the Magician's Skull, and it really is a living pioneer in building out a lot of the spaces. So when you talk about sword and sorcery and how it impacts the space of Afrofuturism, he's really like not just a thought leader. He's a man that's making this stuff. And so he also has launched a sword and sorcery game called Kikanga that's based off of traditional cards, but fits into the story of a whole sword and sorcery genre. And so the idea is, I think they have a second iteration of that coming. It was a Kickstarter. It was very limited, but it won some awards. Again, it's called Kikanga, Kikhanga, and but Mr. Davis is very intentional in taking the historical context. And it was something we talked about in another spaces. How do we have traditional underrepresented history brought into the space of sword and sorcery? So it's a way to introduce this to even another larger group of people who love historical fiction. And how do we take that, but also marry that with an underrepresented space of unauthentic, but again, underrepresented historical space. So this is a way that also bolsters the sword and sorcery genre, also brings in new readers and helps perpetuate the space that it is that outsider motif and that appeal that makes this such a lasting genre, but at the same time is a great vehicle to expand into all the other spaces that we all enjoy that's coherent with it as well.
His Chunga series is terrific.
Yep.
Just a great series set in like 15th century Indian Ocean, following a mariner who goes everywhere from Great Zimbabwe to the coast of India, and there you can smell the sea foam coming off the stories. They're terrific.
That's awesome. So we are at a gaming convention, and we've started to talk about, I don't know, the blend of some sword and sorcery into other media, but specifically games. I'm trying to think of with narrative storytelling and games with sword and sorcery. Well, you probably have a lot to say, but it's open to everybody. So
I mean, I'll start, I guess. So, like, Conan the Barbarian used to be a household name, right? Back when Roy Thomas was doing the comics and Arnold Schwarzenegger started in the films. And then it sort of fell out of fashion somewhat. But that character, as far as a brand and an IP, has stayed alive and in the public sphere mostly through gaming, whether it's video games, role-playing games, board games. there's a ton of them, and Fred Momberg, who is president of the Heroic Signatures imprint, he started as a gamer, and he has been bringing Conan to the gaming sphere quite a lot. And the other piece is that Appendix N, right? From that was second ed, right? AD&D was
No, that was the first one.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, check that.
This is the very beginning of D&D.
Survey from the crowd, first edition?
AD&D.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
pretty sure.
that Appendix N is what sent me to the Library and Used Bookstore to start exploring fiction. That's how I found Chronicles of Amber and Fritz Leiber, and then launched. Before that, I'd been reading science fiction. That blew my mind, and
Yeah.
so I've been fascinated with fantasy ever since.
Yeah, and I kind of, for a lot of people, your first brush, probably a lot of people here, your first main brush with fantasy was probably Tolkien and or Dungeons and Dragons. And when you look back at the older influences, this is not me besmirching what Dungeons and Dragons is doing now. It's just that it's too clean. It's too we're an adventuring party and we're often altruistic, and that's great. That's great. I'm again not a problem. But we have gotten away from the roots, right? There was a lot of sword and sorcery roots in the older Dungeons and Dragons stuff. You see it in the art. You see it in the sort of context of, hey, let's go in this dungeon and probably die or not. And now there's a lot of like safety nets on things, right? And
Try dropping Chun the Unavoidable as a boss in
Yeah.
pretty much any modern day
Yeah.
D&D game.
And I'll talk very briefly about what I'm doing with this new Conan role-playing game. Is that, to me, I really want to bring it back to pulp storytelling. I want it to be fast. I don't want the GM to have to study crap for hours to prepare it. Again, not a problem. That's the thing. People are into it. Do it. I'm 41 and I don't have time for that. I want to be able to look at the thing, run the thing, and I want the comment to be blazing fast and feel empowering. And this is not a panel about adapting sword and sorcery to games, but I think that there's a good marriage there.
It lends itself well to it.
Yeah, and that's all I have to say about that.
I'd say it also does really well in music. Like,
Oh, metal.
heavy metal has been where it's really thrived. I mean, that's where I first discovered Michael Moorcock. I didn't,
Yeah.
but
Nice.
Now you get the Michael Moorcock side of it, which is like sort of elevated metal influences. Then you get the Manowar,
Yeah.
which is like fur diaper, greased biceps, which is also kind of cool. But yeah,
I always feel so out of step with that part of the story. Because I love the Beatles. So,
Yeah, I know.
you know.
Beatles and Star Trek.
Okay, I got about 10 minutes left to cover a lot of ground.
Oh, sorry.
Real quick call out to Howard down there. So I think there's a while ago, maybe 10-ish years ago, maybe longer now, time's flying, where I think you pitched an idea in a blog about having sword sorcery needing a new edge. And actually that, whether or not you knew it, obviously, years later, actually people started latching onto that like it was a moniker of some sort. I know it inspired Oliver a bit, and Scott Oden, they talked a lot about it. But can you comment on that real quick?
Well, yeah.
Because it talks about where we're going. Yeah.
I don't know what to say about where it's going because I don't know. I sure hope
Yeah.
it's going in the right direction.
kind of
My-
up to
Yeah, it's up to you guys.
Yeah. My thought was that sword and sorcery was still viable, and I felt like it had been steamrolled by epic fantasy. Not that I hated epic fantasy. It's just that why can't there be multiple flavors at the table? Why do we have to only have this flavor? And so I felt like I was shouting into the void because people were like, sword and sorcery, that's where they wear the fur diapers. It's just about lopping off monster heads and getting the babes. Well, the worst of it, sure.
Yeah.
But
The worst of it is Deathstalker too. It is.
Let's not talk about that.
It had almost become a character of itself. It was easier to find comic satire sword and sorcery than the real thing,
Yep.
right? And so I said, well, maybe we need to publicly talk about it. And it wasn't like it was just me. There were a bunch of us who were talking about it. And we said, well, what can we call what we're doing? Because there were people who were legitimately trying to create stuff. And stuff that was leaving the suspect racism and sexism and suspect politics behind, but going back and getting the energy and the drive and the pacing and the love of the weird and the horror. But leaving the bad stuff. What can we call it? It's like dusting the rust off of a bad blade. Well, let's call it the new edge. And it's like, well, there was the new weird at the time, and I forget what some of the other new things were, but I said, let's just call it the new edge. And it was like, okay, that's cool. And so I was working for some little e-zine at the time called, what was that, Flashing Swords. And then I think I wrote another essay also about the new edge when I began working for Blackgate. And then, it was like shouting into the wind, nobody cared. So it's very interesting to me that 10 or 12 years later, someone did pick up on it. It's like, oh. But again, I try to say we weren't really trying to start a movement. We were recognizing what was already underway. People were trying to write. They were trying to leave these things behind and just take the good things forward. And we were just labeling what was already underway. And actually, a lot of people have tried to label what's already underway. It feels like there's all these different movements that are going on, doing basically the same thing, and they're calling it different stuff. And I kind of wish we could all just get together and just create it and get it in front of people.
And you are starting to see that somewhat. I mean, you have the New Edge, the pulp revival movement, the iron. There's one group calling themselves the Iron Age. After you have the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age of comics, and there are a lot of really interesting creators on all sides of it, offering nearly any kind of story you would want in this genre, which is really exciting. After years of basically having to chase down Conan reprints. And not even the good ones, because Robert, you had the Clonans for the most part. But
Well, real quick, so we're running out of time, well, because we have a few more things to discuss as we close soon. But other questions from the crowd? You guys have been pretty free, but is there someone who wanted to say something or ask? And no, are we good? There we go. Yeah.
So you actually did mention it, the perception that a lot of sword and sorcery is basically the main dude being buff and trying to get laid. And I'm just wondering how that's sort of that scintillating borderline softcore element has changed or been a part of the genre from the start, or to the present day.
The Canadians going over here.
Well, from my point of view, is that like the market for that is very niche at this point, and I don't. There's still people writing it. You'll encounter them in different publishers, and frankly, that's if someone wants to read that stuff, someone should write it and sell it to them. That's fair. But to me, it's most of the things I'm seeing, like what we're seeing submitted for Book of Blades and these other places. It's not. Sure, you'll have someone who's strong and makes their own destiny kind of thing, but I don't see a lot of Manowar album covers in that fiction anymore. That's fallen out. You might see it still in the art a little, which, frankly, as long as everyone's included, you can have some muscles and stuff. That's okay. You can have some. They can be muscles from various people.
look, if the dude needs to take his shirt off to sell 1,000 more copies of the book.
Yeah. It gets ripped off from Eldritch Horrors, and there we go. I don't know if I answered that question.
Actually, yeah. Well, I want to make sure everyone has a chance to close and talk, and then we did it, and during that time we can talk about some of the different markets you guys. We've already talked about some, but we can recap them so people have an idea of some different magazines and stuff you can either submit things to or just read from. But along with markets, there's some communities that are similar. I don't know if you can differentiate. Well, a lot of communities come along with something. I'm rambling about that. I'm thinking like the Discord with Whetstone and your podcast with your thing. So a lot of times there's like a community around. So if you have any thoughts on communities or markets that are kind of new, share either of those and give some closing thoughts. And you all have a minute and a half each about. So, Dedren, it's your turn. I want to hear from you.
All right, no worries. So,
Yeah.
no, thank you. So I think in the space of where we are with Afrofuturism and speculative fiction, there's definitely an advent of sword and sorcery. I think it lends well to some tried and true genre, but also being able to reimagine it and reintroduce it to a new generation, but also to a prior generation that may not have felt like it definitely spoke to them. I think that a lot of the work that we see there now is more introspective of those traditional tropes of just that kind of Conan, but the traditional hero that's with the sword going out to just fight, and I think there's so much more to the genre that's being introduced, and so I'm just happy to see that works that hopefully myself and others can be to help keep that as a lasting space. For us, our work is called Sorghum and Spear. That's our African fantasy series. It is all women, it's protagonists and villainesses and all the characters in between. And so I think that's our point to introduce a new perspective to the sword and soul genre and sword and sorcery in some. You can find us at Subsume, and my name's Dedren Snead, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Sean?
This is where I get to be the guy that says,
Oh, you
to quote Brooklyn's favorite poet, don't call it a comeback. Bane's been here for years. People have been asking for trad publishers to go back into sword and sorcery for decades in some cases, and even during the dark days of epic fantasy running roughshod over the genre, Bane was out there publishing David Drake's Vedius and Friends, Karl Edward Wagner's Cain, Michael Shia's Niftaline, and I will tell you, we would love to start doing some classical reprints. I know Howard and I would kill to do some anthologies, and the way you do that, all you guys wondering where that new sword and sorcery stuff is, you support the shit out of it. We have great stuff. We have the Thomas the Rhymer trilogy from Gregory Frost. We have Wraithbound by Tim Akers. We have the Forgotten Warrior saga by Larry Correa. We have Indrajit and Fix by Dave Butler. And of course, we've got the Chronicles of Hanover by Howard Andrew Jones. You want it in hard, you want that stuff back on the shelves. There's only one way that happens, and that's by you actually going out to support it. It doesn't happen just with us. It doesn't happen just with the authors or these characters. Sword and sorcery needs the fandom. And so long as you're out there, the genre will never die. So, Howard?
Well, I really want you to support Sword and Sorcery, and I really want you to read my book. And I'm going to give you a real quick pitch. So keep in mind, this has an ancient Mediterranean vibe. Alone, how to start this?
The city of Valanus has fallen.
Yeah. When the city of Valanus fell at last, its people fought block by block, house by house, until most of them died with sword in hand. Only a few thousand survived to be led away in chains. So complete was the Dervan Empire's destruction that they set fire to the temples. They looted the treasuries. They sowed the ground with salt. They overlooked only one small detail. The greatest Villani general had escaped alive. Now, alone against a vast empire, Hanover has only an aging sword arm, a lifetime of wisdom, and the greatest military mind in the world, bent upon a single goal. No matter where his people have been taken, from the remotest outpost of the empire to its rotten heart, he will find them, every last one of them, and he will set them free.
And there's that blood and thunder.
And of course,
we have some
here,
magician
by the
skill.
way, with a USB drive. It's down there.
I get to follow that.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
Just say you're sorry. I mean, but part of the sword-
Sorry.
Do you have any protein?
Yeah. Protein. Gains, bro.
Never see you bash muscles, man.
No, I would say, obviously, yes, A Book of Blades is the thing we're hawking right now. That's great. Tales from the Magician's Skull is peerless as far as what they're putting out, and it's not getting the readers it should have. And I'm telling you, go stop by the Goodman Games booth and just leaf through one of these. It has stats in the back for the creatures, for Dungeon Crawl Classics if you're into it. So we would love you to support that as well. If you're into social media, the Whetstone Discord is an incredibly friendly place. Hop on over there. If you're gamingly inclined and you like Conan, I do Conan Gaming Group on Facebook. I keep it civil and kind. Whetstone, again, is free. Check that out. You can read it on your lunch break. New Edge Sword and Sorcery. Old Moon Quarterly. And even if you're, like, I feel a little bit like we're saying, you got to buy the books, folks. I'm talking to a room of 20 people here. But we're not trying to say go buy everything. But like, if you can boost a signal, if you can share a thing, if you see a thing,
Review a thing.
That's all very helpful.
I got about 1 minute to wrap things up more. I think one thing I've been really impressed with the sword sorcery communities I've been involved with in Goodreads and Whetstone is how often the writers just want to help the other writers.
Yep.
It actually is quite incredible. And so we covered. Oh, and a lot of the markets that are coming out of those groups are just kind of peers helping peers. So a lot of them are. There's a lot of I think Sword Sorceries is an online free to read Which is
Sword and
similar to
Sorcery
the-
magazine.
Sorcery
Yeah,
magazine.
also a
yeah.
free online.
Yeah, it's very
resource.
similar to the Whetstone. There's Pearl Universe's Sword and Sorcery anthologies. We got all of our bracket
Don't forget
versions.
DMR.
DMR, yeah, DMR
DMR.
books are awesome. Rogue Blades from Jason M. Waltz. He's actually doing a Kickstarter pretty soon. He wrote Return of the Sword. Sorry, he's the editor for Return of the Sword. Came out about 15 years ago. But he has about I want to say about 8-ish, maybe or so awesome anthologies that are Sword and Sorcery based, and he has another one coming out soon, Kickstarter, in about a month or two.
Yeah, he's got one coming out with some big names in it.
Yeah.
Steven Erickson contributes. Joe Lansdale. Anyways,
Yeah.
some pretty big names. So neither Beg nor Yield is a Kickstarter you should
Yeah.
check out around the end of the month.
Yep. So my last pitch is, look into this if you want. You can help the whole community. And I want to thank everyone up here. You get up real quick. Anyway, we have to go. We have to get out of the room before, to switch out.
I have time to give these away.
Oh, please, give books away. How do you do that? Do it quick.
So, first, do we have any veterans of the United States military in the room? Coming up, get a free book.
Thank you.
Do we have any librarians in the room?
Yes.
Coming up, get a free book. We have one more. Who here likes science fiction as
I
much
have
as they love?
stories in here.
Come on up, get a free book.
I have one in here and I'm volume
So-
one.
That's
all right.
And volume one as well. And my buddy and I, we just kind of
please.
get our friends, people to come in and write in it. It's an established writers.
If you like dying,
An ebook? Yeah. If you just go to Amazon.
DJ Butler writes
it's right on.
just
Yeah.
as good.
Thanks, man.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Stories as fancy as
Oh, thanks, Alex. You need to. Can you get a picture? We got
We have a couple.
One more.
Okay, someone in here. I think we're the last one. I have to pull yellow thing. I wouldn't mind getting a better picture where we're standing up.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
We don't have anything in here afterwards.
And now I don't have to pack them.
Hey, Howard, you said I was going to get a picture of us standing up here. Oh, what is that?
African history, African myth,
Oh,
culture.
what is it?